When you're studying environmental law, you'll find there are certain cases that are just foundational. And today, we're going to dive into one of the big ones, the 1996 Supreme Court judgment in Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum versus Union of India. Seriously, this isn't just another case, it's a pillar of Indian environmental law. And if you're preparing for exams, you absolutely need to know it inside and out.
Okay, but before we get into all the legal principles and doctrines, we have to understand the human crisis that started it all. This quote you see here, it's not just some dry legal text. It's the voice of a community watching its lifeline, the river Vellore literally being poisoned. At its heart, this entire legal battle began with a simple, terrifying fact. People could no longer drink their own water.
All right, so to make sense of all this, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with the environmental disaster itself, the poisoned river. Then we'll look at the long fight to bring the polluters to court. After that, and this is the really juicy part, we'll get into the 3 groundbreaking legal principles the court established. Then we'll look at the court's final orders, and finally, we'll wrap up with why this case has such a massive legacy.
So, first up, what was actually happening on the ground? Let's take a look at the catastrophe in Tamil Nadu that was so bad, it forced the highest court in the country to step in.
So, this whole thing kicked off with what's called a public interest litigation, or a PIL, filed under Article 32 of the Constitution. The group that filed it, the Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum, saw hundreds of tanneries just dumping their untreated, toxic waste straight into the fields and rivers. And what's really important to get here is that they weren't just going after one bad factory. They were challenging the destructive habits of an entire industry.
And look, this case wasn't just based on feelings. It was built on some really shocking numbers. The court was looking at evidence showing that almost 35,000 hectares of farmland had been destroyed. 350 wells that people drank from, were polluted beyond use. And this was all thanks to a toxic cocktail of about 170 different chemicals, like chromium sulfate, just being dumped right into the local environment.
And to really get a sense of just how intense this problem was, think about this number, 40 liters. The court documents showed that it took 40 liters of water, laced with all those chemicals, to process just 1 single kilogram of leather. Now, try to imagine hundreds of tons of leather being processed every single day. It created this non-stop flood of toxic wastewater that was just seeping back into the ground.
So the bottom line is this. The tanneries were just letting this toxic sludge pour out into the environment. It poisoned the soil, which killed the farms, and it flowed directly into the river Vellore. And this wasn't just some random river, it was the main water source for the whole area, for drinking, for farming, for everything. The community's very survival was on the line.
Now, this whole disaster didn't just happen overnight, and neither did the legal battle. No, this conflict was really the result of years and years of inaction and broken promises from the industries that were doing the polluting.
You can really see the court's patience wearing thin when you look at this timeline. I mean, the problem was known all the way back in the 1980s. That's when tanneries were first told to build effluent treatment plants, or ETPs. But by 1991, when the citizens filed their petition, basically nothing had changed. For years, the court kept issuing orders, extending deadlines, but, as the judgment itself puts it, the tanneries were not even listening. It was this constant refusal to comply that finally pushed the court to take some serious, decisive action.
So, what the court was really wrestling with here was this classic, age-old conflict. On one side, you have the leather industry. It's a huge earner of foreign exchange, provides tons of jobs, and the judgment even says it has vital importance to the country. But on the other side, you have the fundamental right of people to live in a clean and healthy environment. So the big question for the Supreme Court was, which one wins?
All right, now the court's answer to that question is what makes this case legendary. So I need you to pay close attention here. Because for your exam, this is the absolute heart of the judgment. The court took 3 environmental principles, known internationally, and officially made them a part of Indian law.
The very first pillar the court brought in was sustainable development. They took the classic definition, from the Brundtland Report, and used it to directly tackle that economy versus environment debate. And in doing so, they completely changed the conversation.
And this one line from the judgment really says it all. The court just threw out that old argument that you have to choose between jobs and the environment. They declared that, nope, the two have to go hand in hand. Development is essential for sure, but it absolutely cannot come at the cost of destroying our environment. Sustainable development became the new rule of thumb.
The second pillar is the precautionary principle. Think of this as a better safe than sorry rule for the environment. It's proactive, not reactive. What it basically says is,
You don't have to wait for 100% solid scientific proof that something is causing harm before you act. If there's a serious threat of irreversible damage, you have to take precautions now.
So the court broke this down into 3 key ideas. First, you have to be proactive. Don't wait for pollution to happen. You have to anticipate it, prevent it, and attack the root causes. Second, a lack of scientific certainty is not an excuse to do nothing. And number 3, and listen up because this is a total game changer in law, the burden of proof gets flipped on its head. It used to be that the person complaining had to prove something was harmful. The court said no more. Now the responsibility, the onus, is on the industry or the developer to prove that what they're doing is not harmful. That is huge.
And finally, we have the third pillar, the polluter pays principle. Now the name sounds simple, right? But the way the court defined it, wow, it gave this principle some serious bite. It means a polluter is absolutely responsible for the damage they cause, but it's way more than just paying a fine.
This quote from the court really spells out just how far this principle goes. The polluter has 2 major responsibilities. First, they have to pay compensation to the individual people who suffered. But second, and this is just as important, they have to pay the cost of restoring the environment back to how it was. That means paying to clean up the river, fix the soil, basically paying for the entire cost of reversing the ecological damage they caused.
Okay, so the court lays down these 3 huge legal principles. But what did that actually mean for the tanneries in Vellore? How did the court put these ideas into action? Let's break down the specific orders the court gave in its final judgment.
The court didn't mess around. Its orders were sharp and to the point. First, the hammer came down. Any tannery that didn't have a working pollution control system had to shut down immediately. Second, it slapped a pollution fine on them, which had to be paid into a new Environment Protection Fund. Third, it restated that they were on the hook for paying compensation. But then they did something really smart. They started building new systems. The court ordered the central government to create a brand new authority whose job was to figure out the cost of the damage and collect the money. And finally, knowing how complex these cases are, it told the Madras High Court to create a special green bench just to handle environmental cases.
You can just see from the headnotes of the case here, the court's orders were massive. This wasn't just a simple ruling. It was basically a blueprint for how environmental issues should be handled in the future. And creating that new central authority, that was a brilliant move to make sure the court's principles would actually be put into practice on the ground.
All right, we've gone through the problem, the legal fight, the principles, and the verdict. So let's wrap this up by looking at the big picture, the lasting impact of this case. Why is it considered such a landmark for Indian law?
So, this is the big why does it matter question, and it's probably the exact question you're going to get on your exam. It's not enough to just know the facts of the case. You have to understand its significance. So let's nail down the key takeaways.
So here are the key takeaways, the legacy of this case. First, the Vellore case is famous because it took sustainable development, the precautionary principle, and the polluter pays principle and officially wove them into the fabric of Indian law. Second, it made it crystal clear that the fundamental right to life under Article 21 includes the right to a clean and healthy environment. Third, it created a real system for accountability by flipping the burden of proof onto the polluter. Fourth, it didn't just talk about principles, it actually built institutions, like that central authority and the green benches, to enforce them. And finally, it's a shining example of judicial activism, where the court stepped up in a big way because other parts of the government had failed to protect the people and their environment.
And I want to leave you with one last, really powerful idea from the judgment. The court said that, yes, the Constitution protects your right to a clean environment, but the source of that right, where it truly comes from, is even deeper. It's an inalienable common law right. Just by saying that, the Supreme Court lifted environmental protection up to be one of the most basic, fundamental rights a person can have, sealing the Vellore judgment's place in history as a powerful shield for India's ecology.